The other thing while Alan is doing that, the idea of pass notes is really just to give you some overview immediately after this issue's come out from Welsh Government. As Eleanor will talk, there'll be a number of events and things over the summer to look at this in more detail. But the idea is what's happening right now. Yeah. Over to you, Eleanor.
Is that the right version, David? Or do we need to switch speaker view?
I can see it in full. No, it looks good.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great to see so many faces, familiar faces and some new faces this morning. Thanks for your time. As David said, this is going to be quite a short, sharp version of what's happening with rent policy right now and what you really do need to know. It follows the announcement, of course, a week ago today from the Welsh Government on a consultation on a new rent and service charge standard for Wales. And as Welsh Government say, as you see in that quote there, this consultation is going to allow Welsh Government to understand, form, influence and outline a proposal for rent policy over the next 5 to 10 years. And we'll dive into that time frame as we go on today. It's available on the website. I'm sure one of my colleagues in the chat will be able to share the link. So if you would like to have a look at it yourself, please do. It's available bilingually through Welsh Government. So what are Welsh Government actually consulting on? Again, we know it's the topic of rent, but it's all about this rent standard. The 2019 rent standard set limits on rent increases for the 5 years, and obviously that was then increased an additional year last year to gather views from organisations and tenants in Wales and people as well like TPAS Cymru. We've been really involved in this process over the last year. David Wilton in the room here talks with the Welsh Government in their rent meetings, and this consultation will then use that feedback to help shape a fair, clear and sustainable policy for the next 5 to 10 years. But the Welsh Government really are focusing here on making rents affordable and protecting tenants from hardship. You can see that in the standard, in the consultation as well, and through the questions, which I'll dive into. So this does follow, as I said, a working group the Welsh Government have. David, do you want to jump in?
It was just let you know, it's been about 18 months. I think it's been about a year's work. There's a lot of different groups. Some of you may have been part of them. There was one on what is affordability and different models of affordability. One was on, is there a way of doing rent differently instead of CPI +1, CPI +2, things like that? Could you link it to energy efficiency? Could you link it to market rents? Things like that. A lot of different models out there. Tenant voice, where is that in all that? So as tenants, some of you might have been involved in it. Finance as well. As much as I don't like talking about it, you know, the rates the Welsh Government, the Welsh Housing Association can borrow at determine. It's such a big factor now of their finances that determines the affordability and things like that, and what the landlords need to charge. So lots of different subgroups. There was and TPAS were involved in a number of those subgroups, reporting to a main group and then advising Welsh Government. So we met for about a year. The joke was we'll spend a year and then come back with CPI +1. And I'll let you see what comes next.
So as you see,
but a lot of work went into it. I'm not sure how much of it worked and how much was listened to. Yeah.
Well, we'll get into that and what the proposal is for the new standard in a moment. But looking at what's currently in policy, so the 2019 standard set a 5-year capped rent and looked at the topic of CPI. And I think it's important to touch on what CPI is here for those who may not be in the know. So CPI is the main measure of inflation, but there's a lot of conversation in the new rent standard document in consultation about CPIH, which is a very hot topic at the moment in the sector. And it's the measure of UK inflation, including how prices are rising, including the cost of housing. So that's discussed. But again, you'll see in the consultation for the current new standard that it looks at CPI, not CPIH.
One of the reasons I think was that PRS and private rental sector is rising quite a bit, or has over a number of years, and that pushes up that metric quite high. So you would end up with CPI. Sounds better to have housing costs in there, but from a tenant perspective, that rate is going to be higher because you're including private rental sector. If you're a landlord, social landlord, then you would get an artificial price as well. So definitions really do matter, even though they're quite dull and boring sometimes.
Mm.
Definitions in this consultation matter a lot in rent
Mm.
setting.
It's so true. And as we go now into the next few slides, we're going to touch on the themes that Welsh Government set out in this consultation. If you look at the consultation document, if you choose to, you'll see there's quite a lengthy introduction and it covers on quite a few themes on affordability, service charges, and tenant engagement and involvement as well. So we're going to now just jump into those for a few minutes and tell you what the Welsh Government is saying on the context behind the decisions and the questions they're posing. So looking at affordability, the Welsh Government look at three things with affordability. Firstly, the living rent model. So Welsh Government define living rent as 28% of the household income, and they ask in this consultation for the living rent model to guide rent setting and affordability. So that's the measure we're looking at right now in the consultation. But there's also a prior pledge to the sector from 2022. In 22, the sector pledged to work together with Welsh Government, so the sector being social landlords, third sector organisations like TPAS Cymru, and the working groups we've described previously. This group's pledged to work together with Welsh Government to develop a consistent approach to assessing affordability, so we're all on the same page, as you'd say. But then most importantly, looking at affordability here in the consultation document is Welsh Government's principle, as they call it, on affordability. They're consulting on a proposed principle of affordability. As you see in that quote, they say affordability requires a balancing the needs of social landlords and the tenants, ensuring rents may remain affordable for both new and existing tenants while enabling social landlords to meet tenants' housing need. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to anyone who's worked with Welsh Government previously on affordability. They want to be able to build new houses, but also pay for existing works, but also be affordable to tenants, which is such a fine line to balance on here. David, would you like to come in on
Yeah,
anything on that?
Eleanor knows that I was quite disappointed in this section. There was a lot of good work. There's some brilliant people in Wales, in the Bevan Foundation, in Shelter, Joseph Randy, who have been looking at models of affordability and definitions and things like that. My personal view on this paper is there's a lot of talk and definitely, talking about affordability is really important, really important. And it completely avoids, I think, setting any affordability metrics. I don't think there's a model that's approved that talks about living rent model as a guide. It talks about certain things as, you know, we pledge to work to, it's just words to me, some of it. And that was the bit probably out of all of this today that I was the most disappointed with. It just says landlords need to ensure rents are affordable. Okay. And I know there's good work out there by people doing that, but this consultation just says landlords make sure your rents are affordable.
It's so true. And I think there's, caution from many on this consultation that there's, intention to be affordable, but what's going to be the measurement of that? And how
Yeah,
is it going to be held to account?
yeah,
The next big topic the consultation looks at is the topic of service charges. This is obviously quite a big conversation in the sector at the moment on affordability of service charges. But firstly, before we dive into this, TPAS has insight from Welsh Government that there's a big piece of work coming separate to the consultation on service charges later this year. The Welsh Government will be doing their own piece of work evaluating service charges post this consultation being done. So this is not the only piece of work on service charges that will be done this year, but it's an important part of the conversation about affordability. And the reason Welsh Government includes service charges in this is because of the price spike we've seen on service charges, calling for tenants are calling for Welsh Government to cap service charges. But there's an increasing pressure, obviously, to ensure that service charges are funding the required work of landlords like WHQS. But the Welsh Government are really keen to shape their work on this by direct listening and working with tenants and social landlords. And this includes some work they're doing with TWS Cymru. We'll share some links later on, but we're really pleased to have Rupert Antonio from Welsh Government leading on rent policy at our Tenants Voice Cymru Forum in a few weeks. So she'll be touching on service charges. So please do come along to that.
I think it's fair to say this bit, isn't it? As you say, is just we need more transparency on service charges.
Mm,
The actual service policy charge policy, much bigger piece of work later in the
mm.
year. Some good questions here about transparency, but much bigger picture to come, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you say, there's 8 proposed changes regarding service charges, which is quite a lot, and will transform the sector, looking at remaining affordable and reasonable, um, annually reviewing, providing tenants with notice, and providing tenants with transparency, clear information, like what is my service charge actually paying for, consulting with tenants, developing communications, and showing tenants where to access information, and signposting recourse mechanisms. And the Welsh Government in the consultation specifically do talk about signposting to the Ombudsman. So it's really good to see that strengthening of tenant scrutiny and engagement on service charges, and also outlining what will be done by everybody and having a consistent view across the sector on service charges. David?
Yeah, so we joked about this. We spent 18 months in committees and stuff. I said there's a tie this year. A number of people, and we said, I bet we end up with CPI plus one again, which was basically the last 20 years has been CPI plus something, plus two, plus one and a half, different models. And the Welsh Government have said they're proposing to stick with CPI plus one. My reading of that is two reasons. One is they understand it, the sector understands it, we all know what it means. And secondly, there was a lot of worry about developing a Welsh way or a different way, and about what that means for the finance people, UK finance, the loans, the Welsh housing has to borrow a lot of money, and it has to borrow it from banks and different institutions, and it has to compete against England. England have CPI plus one. That's already been announced. They're just debating 5 or 10 year at the moment, but there was a concern, I think, amongst certain people in the sector of developing a Welsh solution that would be different and what impact that would have on CPI. I'm not going to lie, I was disappointed about this. I thought there was a lot of different other ways we could have done rent. But I think that alignment and convergence with England's argument was much stronger. And we're sticking with this. Oh, that's been proposed, sorry. This is what's been proposed.
And then looking at target rent bands as well, which is quite a featured part of the consultation.
Yeah, so target rent bands, some of you know what these are. I'm not going to go into detail. It was a historic way of trying to realign certain rents in certain areas and attract average weekly rents. It got suspended a good 5 years ago now. It was the beginning of COVID
Yes.
because there wasn't enough data out there and there wasn't enough people to collect it. And so it's been suspended about 5 years, and now they're finally putting it to bed or proposing to go, we're not going to use that anymore, because there are other ways they believe of making rents iron out a bit fairer within a landlord or within an area, because you sometimes get anomalies and stuff. So they were no big surprise. I don't think anyone in the sector that these are finally being scrapped.
Mhm.
I'm not
And then,
too concerned about that. I think there's other ways of aligning rents.
fab. And the Welsh Government then go and talk about something called warm rents, which is a massive conversation that we're having in the sector at the moment as well. There's obviously a lot of conversations, but I've definitely spoken with a few social landlords about this topic in the last few weeks. So warm rents is all about paying a cheaper rent for a more decarbonized home or more energy efficient home, because you hopefully, in theory, would pay less bills on that property in terms of heating it. So one option debated is the warm rents model by Welsh Government in the consultation. But this consultation only asks for views and opinions on this. It does not endorse it. It does not say this is going to be considered by Welsh Government. It wants to gather what it could look like in practice and tenants and the sector's views on it. So we will be consulting on this as part of our response as well.
I, I, I think one of the reasons why I'm chuckling on this one is there's a difference between what people say, I think, and what people think. This happens a lot in policy. I think there's very, very little appetite amongst certain parts of the sector and Welsh Government to even contemplate this subject. Yet there's been some good work going on. Pobl have polled tenants and done workshops. I know a number of landlords have as well around linking rent and affordability. But it was there is like Eleanor says, a question or two on it, asking for views. But I sense no appetite for it, if I'm going to be brutal about it.
No, well, it'd be interesting for us to share a tenant voice on this, and we will keep you
Mm.
updated on that moving forward.
Yeah.
The consultation, before we dive into the questions, looks at the topic of tenant engagement, or as they call it in the consultation, tenant involvement, but it looks at two separate parts of it. I can see the chat is active. David, could you keep me appraised of that if
Yeah, no problem.
anything to
Yeah, no
discuss?
problem. Lynn, and I'm going to come back to Lynn's comments and Sam's in a
Fab.
minute. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So the consultation looks at the topic of tenant satisfaction surveys, TSSs. We're all familiar with them. We know what they are. And the Welsh Government outline in the document that they're concerned that not all tenants are seeing TSS data on rents, and they really want to improve this as part of their standard moving forward. And this also includes the quarterly returns. Welsh Government proposed to work with the sector, work with social landlords, work with tenants to bring greater transparency onto rent and what it's being spent on. Obviously, under the current rent standard, social landlords submit a annual self-cert to show them meet the guidelines, but Welsh Government want to work closely with landlords to update it to ensure it's more transparent and that tenants understand what the rent is paying for. Um, Going back to Welsh Government's prior work on this, obviously we do a tenant pulse on rent each year, and the principle of tenants seeing what their rent is spent on is one of the highest desires we see in tenant pulse. Tenants
Mm,
want to know what's being spent on, they want to see the breakdown, and it's really encouraging now to see Welsh Government include this in the rent standard moving forward, or propose to include it. So I'm very keen to see that.
mm.
For the second half of our past notes today, I'm just going to dive into the consultation questions and explain the themes behind it, share anything or what the TPS Government is hearing, and any kind of comments we have really on the questions. We'll try and theme them, and then we'll go into questions from everyone here today. So the first questions, as you can expect, was on affordability and this principle. It's quite a clunky question if you ask me, but it basically asks what this affordability principle should be and if you'd agree or disagree. David, as he said, it doesn't commit to a certain model of affordability, and I think that'd be interesting to ask tenants about what they'd like to see on this principle moving forward. And then
Mm.
we also jump into service charges as well. The Welsh Government want to continue work with the social housing sector to increase transparency and consistency of service charges. And they want to see how we can reinforce transparency, fairness, and accountability in this management. So it'd be very interesting to see then from the consultations, responses from tenants and social landlords, how we could work together to create a more transparent and fair service charge approach as a sector. David, if you don't mind, we're going to ask you to come in on the 5 or 10 year rule because you've got more
Yeah.
insight from England.
So the argument is landlords need to borrow a lot of money, just to do WHQS, to build more homes, things like that, to invest in housing. Um, Rent, they want a lot, certain landlords want a longer term rent commitment so that they can go to the banks and things like that and go, this is the rent model. Banks and stuff they don't know what's going to happen in 5 years' time. So there are certain people who want a longer rent settlement. Other people go, actually, the world could change in 10 years. It's different, 5 years, different models, different governments. What's the point of having a 10-year deal if the government might change next year? You can have a different government who have a different policy. They could literally scrap it the next day. So the 10-year commitment feels a little bit academic anyway. So there's been an argument about 5 and 10. They've gone for 5 years this time, I think, but they're consulting on whether it should be 5 or 10. Um, I've got my personal view. I think it should be 5 years. I understand you need a certain amount of time, but the world's a different place and you're going to have different policies, different models. We might have different models in the future that
Mm.
work elsewhere. And I wouldn't want to be locked into 10 years of CPI plus because it just makes rents more and more unaffordable. But
Yeah.
that's the argument, 5 or 10. Yeah.
It's so true, David. And in our tenant pulse following this consultation, we'll be talking about this with tenants and asking their views.
Mm,
It'd be very interesting. Both have bonuses, both have fallbacks,
mm,
but it'll be interesting to see what the actual decision is at the
mm.
end. So the next questions look at the thoughts on this rent envelope, the CPI plus 1% model. Obviously, a few in the sector are disappointed that we are just consulting on the same thing we've done for the last 5 years. We thought this was possibly a chance for innovation and a Welsh way, as you may say. But it'll be interesting to see what tenants think about what the rent should go up by. And again, this brings up the conversation about if my rent is inflation, that is state services being stable. This is not increase on services. anything below inflation is a cut to services, possibly. And we
Yeah.
need to ensure that we're providing not just homes, as the um, regulatory standards say, we need to ensure that we're keeping a stable and moving forward housing sector.
I want to address for those not familiar with all these arguments, why it's not just CPI, to cover increasing bills. The reality is WHQS costs a lot of money, new homes cost a lot of money, and the landlords need a plus to deliver those. They are the arguments I've heard as well over the last year are, well, about three-quarters of tenants have their rent funded via benefits, via universal credit, via pensions have increased above CPI for a number of years now and will continue that. So their argument is the sector can afford it. I noticed some you popped up saying, on the side saying, yeah, but real wages and self-payers, we call them, the technical name for them, self-payers, don't get that, often don't see their wages going up by the same amount. Totally agree, totally agree. And that is the concern, is that CPI just starts plus each year. We've done this for 20 years, has just made rents more and more unaffordable. It depends if it comes with standards. Like say, if it comes with WHQS energy improvement works, then your bill should be going down and things like that. It's a complex formula, but yeah, it's the other reason why they've stuck with it is because it's known. People have been modeling this for years. The banks know it, landlords know it, tenants know where they stand, rightly or wrongly, and therefore it's a known model. Yeah.
Mhm.
The other thing also is, and I'm not sure if that's what you're saying on the side, Sam, but there's a strong feeling in certain parts of the sector is that existing tenants need to contribute to new homes. Can't pull the drawbridge up, I think is the expression. Once
Mhm.
you're in social housing and you're there for life, if necessary, you can't. Existing tenants need to fund and help fund new homes. I'm not sure I agree with that, but there is, because there's different ways of funding things like that. But that is the thinking at the moment,
Yeah.
certainly amongst policymakers.
And the next question then looks at this very interesting topic, as we've discussed previously in Tenant Pulse on the ministerial cap. I think this should probably be reworded to the Cabinet Secretary's cap, but it looks at whether to amend the parameters that trigger the Welsh Government in getting involved in rent setting, which is obviously set at CPI falling out of the parameters of 0 to 3%. So this gives assurance, and TBAS is really pleased to see this in the consultation because it gives assurance that tenants will be capped, or that rent should be capped to a limit. Tenants will be protected. So we'll be very interested to share
Yeah.
this.
It doesn't mean to say the minister will, it's just that if it goes over 3%, the minister has the right to intervene and maybe put a cap on it. In practice, that's what, three times in about 15 years. And one of them was just capping it at inflation. Two of them were more noticeable interventions. I think also what might happen is you might get it go the other way as well. So if inflation ever got to 0%, technically it should just be 0 plus 1. And what the minister could do under these new rules is potentially put it at 1%. So it'd be, if you're following me, inflation's at 0, CPI is at 0. It could be minimum 1% plus 1. So you could see a 2% rise, even though CPI is at 0. Um, I do think that it's needed. The ministerial intervention, I think, is a safety net for tenants. It's really important. There are a lot of people who will be filling in the consultation speaking against this,
Mhm.
who want, if inflation's at 13% and their costs are going up 30%, well, so should rent.
Mhm.
So this is why consultations matter, because there'll be a lot of other people putting in stuff in different agreements here.
Mhm.
Show your reminders pop up on the screen,
Oh,
Alana.
sorry. I'll just get rid of that for 1 second.
No, it's fine. The
Um,
slides were fine. It was just I think you've lost your slides now.
there we are. Better?
Yeah, that's,
Thank you.
I hope
David,
that
if you
makes
would.
sense. I'm not going to dwell on it much longer. Yeah.
No, and I think there's an argument there about the use of CPI. The consultation looks at which CPI to use. David, I know you've got an opinion on this one. Come on.
No, this isn't necessarily about which CPI. It's about when. I think this is this the One about April and
Yes.
back to Jan. Yeah. So bear with me on this.
Sorry.
Landlord sets CP, sorry, the minister announces what inflation is around late September, October, and that sets the rent then for the next year. And so landlords have got to do then some modelling, they've got to take the board, they've then got notice period under Rented Homes Act to get that all done in the 6 months or so, for or 7 months or so for to then have the statements ready for the 1st of April, but also a notice. Some people went, we need to bring CPI back, like back to the previous April, so a year in advance. Landlords would know a year in advance what the rent rises are going to be. There's some practical terms to that, which is if you're in the finance department, you've got a year of modelling and things like that. Reality is, though, is a lot happens in a year with CPI. So you could end up with CPI could have been at 2%, and by the next year it could be at 10%. The other way around, and I think you'll end up with really out of sync wages, rent rises out of sync with reality at the moment. So I personally am not in favour of this. I think it's whilst it makes it easier for a finance department, I think it makes it quite unsettling for tenants because I think you'll see big differences between real life and the rent then because of that 12-month lag. But let me know, that's the point of a consultation.
Yeah, we want to gather everyone's views and the insight from tenants and members from across Wales. The next question looks about the CPI plus £2 rule, as it's been known in the past. Now it's being proposed to be £2.55p in line with inflation. So it'll be looking at agreeing with the proposal to retain the flexibility that social landlords have to amend rents by this additional money per week. I'm going to speed ahead because I want to give time for questions at the end, and I know we are near the end of time here. But it does also look at this. Oh, I've got an opinion on this question. Apologies for the wording of it, but future economic volatility and inflationary spikes. Um, the Welsh Government want to consult on how they can build in additional safeguards to prevent a future cost of living crisis. So we'll be asking tenants about this in our tenant pulse survey. So we really, really do value your views on this, about if you think there's anything the Welsh Government could do to protect you, if there's anything the Welsh Government could do to protect members. So please do let us know your opinions here. We want to share what you really do think. That's our privilege here at TPAS Cymru.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's a question on target rent bans and if they should be continued or moving forward. But as Dima said, the thought across the sector right now and what we are hearing is not that positive on keeping them moving forward. But it'd be interested to see what's thought of. And then, interestingly, there's a question on exemptions about what should be exempt from this future rent standard. And I'm going to switch on to the next slide. So this is a list from the consultation of what is exempt to the renter service charge standard. So as it says, the standard should not apply to the following property types. So there is quite a hefty list there. I think this is something that we will try and share more fully with tenants and members. But David, do you have any comment on
No,
exception?
some of it is sensible. So things like nursing care could be provided by a social landlord, but it's quite a specialist
Hmm.
sector. It has different costs and different rules and things like that. And so there's an argument. I understand why it's exempt, I get that. Student accommodation, there's market movements and things like that. It's not social housing, but there's a lot of landlords who have built student accommodation. So they're exempt and they're more market led. I get that. There are one or two though. We saw during that high inflation shared ownership. So somebody might own 25% of the property, but are as they view themselves as social renting from a social landlord for 75%. During those high inflation, they were getting their contracts at CPI plus one and things like this. So they were getting 14%, 13% rent rises, and a lot of they were key workers and things like that. I've had an issue with shared ownership on that list. Many of the
Hmm.
others I don't have an issue with, but again, please read them, and if you've got particular views on them, do let us know. There is a good reason why we need some exemptions because they're not social housing, but they might be owned by a social landlord. Yeah.
There's a really good comment in the chat from Vicky. Thanks, Vicky, about seeing landlords seeing increased costs, and we need to be able to give landlords assurance that they can, operate and can provide the services that are being offered right now. Inflation does change so fast. Thank you so much, Vicky, for that comment.
Yeah, I was writing something at the same time. The argument on that 6 month, the notice period, it's really tight to get everything ready for the next March and April.
Hmm.
That's why it's been in the consultation. I just don't want it being out of sync too far away with reality. Yeah.
The next question looks at warm rents, as I discussed. Welsh Government want to hear your views, not an endorsement, but views on how warm rents model could work. Are you for it? Are you against it? This is actually quite interesting because for a number of years, TPAS Cymru has included a question in our rent tenant pulse about would you pay more rent or port rent for your increased EPC? So we'll be interested to see how this is continued and
And
if any
equally, should
trends
you
have
pay
changed.
less rent for poor energy efficiency? It's a two-edged sword on that. Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point, actually.
Mm. I just wouldn't write War and Peace if you are going to do a right consultation. I sense there's not an appetite at this moment to even consider this. But it'd be interesting to see what people write and what people come back with.
Definitely. And then there's an additional question, just finishing off, looking at what additional information would tenants and members and members of the housing community like to see to support and provide strength and accountability to tenants on rent. So this is a bit of an open question, and we'll be consulting on this as part of our tenant pulse. So Welsh Government want to hear your views about what data should be collected and published to tenants to ensure tenants understand what rent is paying for and to build trust between tenants and landlord.
Hmm. To give an example, Scotland have a very, very good quality landlord tenant rent transparency spreadsheet thing, and you can filter on one beds in Dundee, and you can look at council versus the landlords in that county. You can do all sorts of stuff, and it's good. Um, but it
Mm.
costs money, and it costs real money. But the tenants, the landlords, you can see say your council versus your housing association in the same town, compare 2 beds and 3 beds. It's good. Welsh Gov tried to build something just before lockdown, and it wasn't that level. It was poor. It didn't really take off. No one really used it. And that's an example of, would these sort of things help? But equally, everything comes at a cost. So do we need it? Would we use it? Love to talk about, if anyone wants to talk about that or see it again, or maybe we could do something over the summer, if just even if it's 5 or 6 of you, show you the Scottish model, and how it works and what good looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the questions, and that's kind of what the Welsh Government has said in the consultation. I'm just going to quickly do a few more slides on
Mm.
how TPAS Cymru is going to provide opportunity to everyone here today to make sure that your voice is heard in this. So I'm really pleased to say that our 2025 Tenant Pulse on rent is now live on our website. I think my colleague Olivia has put it in the chat, but we want to hear your views. This is, I would argue, the most important rent pulse we've ever done. Now is the time to have your say. Do let us know what you think about these questions. We really do want to share that with Welsh Government. So what will happen now is that TPAS Cymru are holding a series of programme on rent and how you can make sure your voice is heard in this consultation, starting obviously with our Tenant Pulse survey launching today. We're also holding a Tenant Voice Cymru Forum with Rupert Antonio, Rent Lead, to ensure that you share with Rupert your views and that Rupert can share, probably a more informal view on what the Welsh Government are doing to hear tenants' views on rent. If you'd like to read the consultation, it's on the Welsh Government website. We'll put it in the chat now. Please do have a look. And if you have any questions for Welsh Government that TWest Cymru can facilitate asking for you, David sits in these working groups that we're happy to share, the knowledge of. Do let us know and get in touch with us. And
Mm.
then lastly, we're very happy to provide any tenant or staff briefings on this consultation. If you'd like us to come into your own organisation or tenant group or anything that you're involved with, let us know. We can
Mm.
deliver this customised to your area as well. So,
I've already done one with Wales and West tenants late last week. It was a really good session, just talking in more honesty
mhm.
about not all the detail. We didn't go through everything, but the things that mattered to that group. Yeah, more
Mhm.
than happy to do something with anybody.
And just, I know TPS Company does quite a few tenant policies, but our tenant policy on rent really is a special one. It's directly heard by the Cabinet Secretary and her team. It does influence the decision, and it is run by tenants for the Cabinet Secretary to see what the tenant voice is on the subject, and it really is heard. So please don't underestimate the power of tenant policy rent. It's so important to ensure that your voices are heard on this issue. So please do get involved. If you'd rather have a one-to-one chat with me to ensure that you're sharing what's really important to you on this subject, please do get in touch with me or David, and our details are there if you want to drop us an email. But I think we're just about on time, which I'm really pleased about because I thought I'd go on for an hour. But I'm just really thankful to hear from you all here today. Can I take any questions from
Yeah,
anybody? I'll stop sharing or any comments.
I think the first couple of comments like Lynn mentions were certainly um, skepticism, I think is probably the right word, between warm rents and affordability. You know that, well, somebody's decided you got an EPCB house, right, your rent's got to go up to do that. And in most cases, you should have significant energy savings. That's not always guaranteed. And I think that's maybe why I think there's more work to be done on this and to more data and tracking people's energy bills. But equally, it goes back to the individual tenants' use of it. So we saw there's definitely a landlord here who's been here before. They did a lot of energy efficiency work, and people thought they had free electricity. So they all went and bought some hot tubs from Home Bargains, and their electricity bills went through the roof. And they were complaining that their rent wasn't, so their electricity wasn't cheaper. Um, there is a fine line here, and I think we'll see more. So I think there's some that was on the side there, Eleanor. Sam, you're right. This thing about CPI plus one, plus £2 potentially, can mean that rent might or will step away. And that's been going back for 20 years or so now. This plus one and a half. I remember being in a landlord where a tenant came up to me and said, inflation was 2%, it was plus one and a half, plus £2. And so their rent was tripling the rate of inflation. And they were like, I'm not getting that as a wage increase, you know. But other people, it's just paid for under universal credit. So that self-payers subject is really still a very, very hot topic. And I'm very aware of it. And I've always been very aware of that and been arguing behind the scenes. I can't go into all the arguments, but I know, Sam, the pain that you must see sometimes when you see some of these rent rises. Yeah. Yeah.
Fab.
Anything else on the sides?
Um, Not that I can see right now. Nikki, I can see your question to me about when the rent consultation will be finishing. It'll be running for about 2.5 weeks. So the end date should be, I'll find you now, the 25th of July. Sort of
Not
around
a lot of
Friday.
time. The truth is, the sector needs a rent policy. Needs it. It needs it now. It needs to know where it stands. We can't roll it up. Well, it could roll it over another year, but really, that consultation, the civil servants have got to analyse it and announce something by the end of September
Mhm.
because the sector's got to work on it then. It's got to model it and things like that. So they need to have this consultation. They need to close it, analyse it, and get something out. How much
Jill,
that means is actually up for consultation is a very open to debate subject.
that's a good point, David. And Jill, the reason that Welsh survey is only open for 2.5 weeks is because the answers for Welsh Government, the consultation responses, have to be in by the 12th of August.
Oh, so it's more than it's what's that, 5 weeks or so, is it?
It's a
Yeah,
49-day consultation or something.
yeah,
Thank you all for joining. It's great to hear your feedback, and you'll be met as you leave with a feedback response as well. So we really do value any feedback you have on today's session. I just want to say diolch yn fawr and have a lovely week.
yeah. Do come to Tenant Voice Cymru. That's a chance to talk to the civil servant literally in charge of all this. So when we've got that date announced, we'll please do come and you can speak to the person in running it. Yeah.
Fab. Thank you all. Have a
Yes.
lovely
Thanks,
day.
everyone. I'm happy to stay on if anyone's got any questions or anyone wants to
Same
ask
here.
anything, or if you want to message us privately afterwards, any Anything we have, want to clarify or anything? More than happy to.
Said my bit about SERPs.
Sorry?
I just said my bit about SERPs, mate. I mean,
Yeah, no,
with warm homes, like, that's I spent my weekend reading the consultation and doing maths, and like I'm a sad case, I know I am, mate. But like, genuinely, like, I mean, we've got to be careful with the warm. I know that it's just a proposal.
I don't think it's going anywhere. My
I,
personal view, it's they've
from
put it in
reading
because they
it,
had to.
yeah, from reading it, that was my feeling. But
Yeah,
we've got to be
there's
careful with SERPs because
yeah.
you and I both know from the SERPs issue that alone, because they can say you've got a warm home,
Yeah.
but if the SERPs are being reinvested to build new homes and what have you, which isn't an issue because we understand on different investment models, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you on paper have got a warm home with panels, but those SERPs aren't going back to the tenant, you could have an EPC a B, and then they look at it and go, well, hang on a minute, you should be paying more rent. But then, in fact, the SERPs you're never seeing because they're going back to the landlord.
There's a lot of open.
It's a minefield.
And it's maybe why they didn't want to go for something different this time. They're stuck with CPI. But it's an interesting subject for future. And I think we need to have that conversation. It's just not going to be now. I just don't think.
Again, I don't understand why they didn't think of something like the Bank of England base rate. I don't understand why that wasn't thought about, because the Bank of England base rate is a truer tracker than the CPI, because CPI is not a true tracker of inflation.
No, to be fair, there was an expert group who looked at lots and lots of these. I wasn't a part of that one.
I mean, I'm not an economist, but
no.
My schoolboy understanding of economy.
It's also understand and following alignment with England. It's a big issue, and there's very valid reason for that. But also, I feel sometimes we're too obsessed with that. And it doesn't give us a chance to look at other ways. And I could feel the wind changing over the last year.